Welcome to CSP 383, Chapter 3, Assessment for Identification. It's a highly technical chapter. It has lots of information in it. So in this PowerPoint, I try to unpack it a bit. Most children with intellectual disabilities have a mild form that's not identified before they begin school. Identification is not just IQ, it also requires deficits in adaptive behavior and school achievement. So we start with problems with assessment before we had the federal law. We used to talk about kids having FLK syndrome, which meant funny looking kid. This didn't happen, but the idea behind it was that kids were put in special ed just because a particular teacher wasn't able to teach them. And there were kids who were placed without parental permission, sometimes on the basis of a single teacher. So there were some kids who had false positives, they were placed who shouldn't be. And then we had false negatives, kids who were not placed who should have been. And so the original federal law was passed in 75, makes sure that children are assessed properly, that we look at the full picture of the child before we put a special ed label on them of any kind. So here are some of the protections in assessment. A child can't receive a disability label based on a single test. The instruments have to be valid, so in other words, used for the reason that that test was developed. They have to be reliable, so they give consistent results. They should be non-discriminatory, so that means that the test should not discriminate on the basis of race or gender or region of the country. The test should be in the child's native language. Qualified people should be giving the tests, and the test should be administered the way they are designed. So here are some of the things we're trying to prevent. There were times when, for instance, if we had a child whose native language was Spanish, instead of giving them a Spanish test, we would give them a test of spoken language or a nonverbal language test. We had classroom teachers giving IQ tests. We had children with visual impairments asked to perform tasks that require eye-hand coordination. Children with hearing impairments given tests that had oral directions. So, first thing you need to know is that the testing that's done to determine whether a child has a disability is individualized testing. They're going to use a combination of norm referenced and criterion referenced tests. Norm reference tests compare the child's performance to that of the children on whom the test was standardized, children of the same age. Criterion reference tests compare the child's performance to a list of skills that children at that age should have. And so when we get a score off a norm reference test, it's actually a score. So the score will be a 70, and that'll be equivalent to an IQ test score. When we get a criterion reference, instead of getting scores, what we get is a list of skills the child knows and skills that he doesn't know, or things he can do and things that he can't do. When we talk about norming a test, what we're talking about is comparing the child's score to, quote, normal children. And so what they do is they give it to a random sample of children, actually a stratified random sample, which means that the sample will have the same percentage, for instance, of African American kids as the population as a whole, or the same percentage of third graders as the population as a whole. And then what they do is they compare the performance of children who take the test after it's published to the group of children that the test was normed on. When we talk about standardization, what we're talking about is that a standardized test has to be given the same way every time it's given. And so you have to read the precise directions. You have to time all or some parts of the test. We have to look at which answers can be counted correct. It actually says you can count this right, you can't count this right. And then it also, on a standardized test, it tells you whether you can ask more questions. So when we talk about stratified random samples, here's what we're talking about. Let's say we wanted to construct a test of math readiness for freshmen at Delta State. We could test every Delta State freshman. But if we're doing individualized testing, that would take a lot of time and it would be very expensive. So what we do is we test a sample group. The closer the group is to actual DS students, the more accurate it would be in predicting math readiness. So we select a sample. These numbers that I'm giving you here are not actual numbers. I'm just using those as illustration. So let's say we had 1,000 freshmen, and we had 653 women and 347 men. And 547 of our students were white, 426 were black. 146 were from in-state, 154 were from out-of-state. 821 were aged 16 to 25, 179 were over 25. So the stratified random sample, if we were going to use 100 students, then we would have 65 women, 35 men, 57 white, 43 black. You see where you get this. So what we do is we would plug into a computer program that we wanted 65% women, 57% white, 85% in-state, 82% in the age range of 16 to 25, and the computer would select a sample of 100 people balanced in those proportions. And when you do stratification categories, you use it based on factors that may affect performance. So, for instance, we wouldn't do stratification based on whether they were Methodist or Baptist, unless we assumed that being Methodist or Baptist would affect math performance. So, what is intelligence? When we're talking about intelligence, what we're talking about is this. We're going to start with the idea of, are you smarter than a kindergartner? That slide does not look like it's going to show for us, which I'm very disappointed that that's not showing. Oh well, such is life. Alrighty, moving on to some theories of intelligence. Okay, I know theories are boring, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it helps us understand some things. So we talk about the Spearman G factor. So the idea behind this, in the definition, you remember the definition from the previous chapter where we talked about significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning. The word general refers to this G factor from Spearman. What Spearman said was that there's actually a construct of an overall intelligence. He said that you can be smart all over or slow all over. Now, he admitted there are S factors that can be measured, specific factors, but that there actually was such a number as a G factor of intelligence that with this number you could compare one person to another in overall intelligence. Thurstone, on the other hand, said that there's no single measure, but he listed 7 primary abilities: verbal relations, how words relate to one another; verbal fluency, how quickly you can generate words; number memory; perceptual speed, so how fast can you perceive what you're seeing or hearing or tasting, touching, so on; induction; and then spatial visualization, how you can see things in space. Then there was Cattell. Cattell also talked about G factor intelligence, but he said there were 2 parts to it: crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence being the things that you know, and fluid intelligence being how you use what you know. The Kaufman assessment battery for children is based on Cattell's theories. Then we had Sternberg, who talked about triarchic intelligence. He talked about analytic, practical, and creative. The analytic was like the G factor intelligence. The practical was solving everyday problems, and the creative was the ability to react to novel stimuli and situations. Then we had Gardner, and he's the most recent of these theorists. Gardner talked about multiple intelligences. He said that you could have linguistic, which is words; logical, mathematical; spatial, which is where things are in space; musical; bodily, kinesthetic, which has to do with movement; interpersonal, how you interact with yourself, that's intrapersonal; interpersonal, how you interact with other people. And then later he added existential, which is understanding where you are in the inner world. and then also naturalistic, how you relate to nature. No formal tests available for Gardner, but it's a real popular idea. Recently, we've beginning to see some new ideas about crystallized and fluid intelligences. Psychologists have long, I'm just going to read this quote to you. Psychologists have long regarded intelligence as coming in two flavors: crystallized, which is your stored up information, and how-to knowledge, and fluid intelligence. Crystallized grows as you age. Fluent has long been known to peak in early adulthood, around college age, and then decline. Unlike physical conditioning that can transform a 98-pound weakling into a hunk, fluid intelligence has always been considered impervious to training. So here are the big 3 IQ tests that we use in Mississippi, and there are other out there. The Kaufman Intelligence Battery. This we use mainly for preschoolers, minority groups, and children with learning disabilities. It has a strong nonverbal measure, and it measures sequential processing, how you process things that are given to you in order, simultaneous processing, how you process multiple stimuli coming at you at once, achievement, and then mental processing. The Stanford Binet was originally designed to decide where children are going to be placed, and it looks at intellectual and cognitive functioning, and it goes all the way from birth to, I think, age 80. It is useful in diagnosing learning disabilities, but it's also good at finding developmental delays, intellectual disabilities, and giftedness. And then you have the Wechsler scales. They're actually there's a preschool scale and adult scale, but this slide talks about the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, and this is used in schools as part of placement evaluation for developmental disabilities. This is the one that they more often use if they think the child has an intellectual disability. Okay, so assessing adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior is the effectiveness or degree with which a person meets the standards of personal independence and social responsibility for age and cultural groups. So ask yourself, at what age should a kid stay at home by himself during the day? Your answer is affected by where you live, what supports you have, and what your community accepts. It's also affected by what opportunities the child has already had. Children in poverty have higher independence skills because they have more opportunity for self-care. So this is one set of tests where kids in poverty actually do better, is adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior includes things like walking, talking, getting dressed. They're things that you do in adapting to your surroundings. They're developmental, and so they are very often given as an age equivalent skill. In addition to that, adaptive behavior scales very often have what are called maladaptive behavior subscales, which look at things like whether the person gets along with others. 3 main assessments for adaptive behavior. There's the ABS-S2, there's the Vineland, and there's the SIB. Each of these have school versions, and they also have versions for residential care. And then we have the diagnostic adaptive behavior scale from the American Association for Individuals with Developmental Disabilities. And this one looks at conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills. That is chapter 3.